Chapter 4. Car Thief. Instinct told Nancy not to go directly home. "No doubt that man behind me wants to find out where I live," she said to herself. "Well, I won't let him." She knew that anyone could find out from the license bureau who owned the car, but this would not necessarily prove that the driver was also the owner. Turning abruptly down a side street, she headed for a parking lot. Nancy quickly found a spot, locked the convertible, and started making her way among the many parked cars. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw her pursuer looking vainly for her out of his window. She smiled that her ruse had worked, then headed for her father's office. "I'll tell Dad what happened and get his advice about this." To avoid detection, Nancy rode in the elevator to a floor above and walked down one flight to Mr. Drew's office. "If that pudgy man saw me come into the building, I guess he's pretty confused by this time." Mr. Drew's secretary, Miss Hanson, looked surprised but glad to see Nancy. "Hi," she greeted her. "Something's on your mind. I can see it in your eyes." Nancy laughed. "You're right. I've just shaken off a man who was following me." Miss Hanson gasped. "How terrible! You did the right thing coming here. Your father has a client in his office, but I think the man will be leaving any minute. Please sit down and tell me about your new mystery." Nancy had just started to explain when the door of her father's office opened. Mr. Drew shook hands with his client, saying he would call him in a couple of days. Then he turned to Nancy. "Hello, dear. Nice to see you. But I have a feeling this isn't a social call." His eyes twinkled. When Nancy reported what had happened to her since leaving Miss Carter's home, the lawyer frowned. "I don't like this," he said. "As you said, the man can trace you. But we'll even things up. I'll call the license bureau right away to find out who this pudgy individual is and if he has tried to trace your license." Mr. Drew asked Miss Hanson to put in the call, and soon he was talking to a man at the Motor Vehicle Bureau. Within a short time, he had his answer. "The name of the owner is Barton Trask," he told Nancy. "Barton is a friend of mine. Miss Hanson, will you please phone him?" While Miss Hanson dialed the number, Mr. Drew said to Nancy, "So far, my dear, no one has tried to get information on you at the Bureau. I've instructed the men there to withhold your address in that event." The ensuing conversation between the lawyer and his friend proved to be enlightening. Mr. Trask said that his car had been stolen several weeks ago and had been sold by the thief, using a forged certificate of ownership. Apparently, the thief had transferred the stolen license plate to another car. "I'll notify the police and the license bureau about all of this," Mr. Drew said. He looked steadily at Nancy. "You've proven to me many times you know how to take care of yourself, but I can't help worrying about you. Right now, I think it would be best if Miss Hanson drives you home. Later, I'll bring your car and make sure no one is following me." Nancy opened her purse and handed over the key. She smiled at her father. "Thanks a million, Dad. And don't forget, early dinner tonight. I have a rehearsal for the play." "I'll be there." Soon after Nancy arrived home, she received a phone call from Chief McGinnis of the River Heights Police Department. He told her that his men were still looking for the thief who had taken Mr. Trask's car. He asked for a full description of the man who had followed Nancy. "I'm afraid it can't be very full," she replied, "because I saw him only behind the wheel of his car. He appeared to be pudgy, double-chinned, and had a small nose. His hair was dark and he had a good deal of it. He was so far down in the seat, I'd say he's short." "That helps," the chief said. Then he chuckled. "I suppose he's part of the new mystery on which you're working." "I'm not sure," Nancy replied, "but I suspect he may be." A few minutes later, as she was about to take a shower, the telephone rang again. This time, a man's high-pitched voice said, "Miss Nancy Drew?" "Yes, who are you?" Nancy asked. "I'll tell you when I come," the stranger replied. "I think you know some secrets I have to have. You stay there in your house. I'll be right over to get them from you." The man hung up. As Nancy stood lost in thought, Hannah Gruen came to her side. "Who was that?" she asked. "I don't know, Hannah. Some man with a high, squeaky voice. He sounds ominous. I wonder if he's the man who followed me from Berryville." "Oh dear," the housekeeper sighed. "Nancy, you just seem to go from one dangerous adventure to another. What did this man want?" Nancy managed a wan smile. "He said I have some secrets he has to have, and he'll be right over to get them." Hannah Gruen bristled. "He will he? Well, we'll not let him in, and that's final." Nancy hugged the housekeeper. "I won't argue with you, but I would like to know who he is." "Never mind about that," Hannah said firmly. "We'll pull down all the shades so he can't look in." Nancy puckered her lips. "And you won't even let me take a peek to see who it is?" "Not even a peek. Let him think he has the wrong house, or anything else he wants to figure out." "I'll leave everything to you," Nancy said with a little smile. "Now I'm going for a nice warm shower and get ready for the rehearsal." She had just started dressing when the front doorbell rang. No one answered. It rang again. Nancy waited to see what Hannah would do. She remained resolute in her resolve. The caller pushed the button for the third time and kept his finger on the bell. It rang for a whole minute, then finally the person gave up. "Just the same, I wish I knew who that was," Nancy thought. She finished dressing and came downstairs to help Hannah with the dinner. As Nancy passed through the front hall, the telephone rang. Was the man with the high, squeaky voice calling again? "I'd better answer anyway," Nancy decided. "It might be Dad, and he'll be worried if he gets no answer." Nancy picked up the phone and said hello in a low voice. "Nancy?" the caller went on. "Remember me? I'm supposed to have a date with you tonight to take you to the rehearsal." "Ned!" Nancy shouted. The relief in her voice, as well as her delight, were very evident to Ned Nickerson, an Emerson College student and star football player, whom she dated frequently. "What's going on?" he asked. "I arrived early and rang your bell, but nobody would let me in. I'm at your neighbor's, Mrs. Humphrey. She was sure something awful must have happened to you." Nancy laughed. "I'm perfectly all right, and so is Hannah. Come on over and I'll tell you why the shades are down and we wouldn't let anybody in." "Okay, I'll do a little staccato on your doorbell so you know who it is." Within 5 minutes, the handsome, dark-haired Ned walked in. "Can't wait to hear the reason for all this secrecy," he said, after greeting Nancy warmly. When Ned heard about the demand made by the mysterious caller, he became alarmed. "Nancy, if this ties in with the new mystery of yours, don't you think you should give it up?" When Nancy did not answer, Ned shrugged. "I suppose there's no use asking you that. Well, where does the mystery stand now?" While she was telling him about the ghostly tapper and the cat thief, she kept wondering if the strange caller would arrive. But another half-hour went by, and he did not appear. Finally, Nancy chuckled. "Ned, I believe you kept that man away from here. Thanks a lot." The couple heard Mr. Drew's key in the front door, and soon afterward, everyone was seated at the dinner table. Hannah had prepared a delicious meal of roast lamb, peas, and raspberry tarts. Conversation was almost entirely about the mystery. When Nancy and Ned were ready to leave the house to attend the rehearsal, Mr. Drew suggested that the two exchange cars after they returned home. He added, "It might keep that man in the black sedan off your trail, Nancy." "Glad to do it, Mr. Drew," Ned said, and Nancy nodded in agreement. "Another thing, Nancy," her father said. "Whenever you leave this house, I want you to wear dark glasses and a scarf that completely covers your head. It may be an unnecessary precaution, but please do it for me." Nancy kissed her father and went upstairs to get a scarf and sunglasses. When she and Ned reached the high school auditorium where the rehearsal was to be held, Ned seated himself about halfway down the center aisle. Nancy went up the steps that led to the stage. Several members of the cast were rushing around, some mumbling their lines to themselves, others reading from the script. The orchestra was tuning up, and the director was giving last-minute instructions to the actors and actresses. The play was a variety show, with a thin thread of plot running through it. Nancy was to appear 3 times in tap numbers, once in the first act in a dialogue with a young man. In the second, she would dance with a group of girls. First, each one would perform an intricate step, then dance together. Just before the finale, in which everyone would sing, Nancy was to perform her solo. The director, Mr. Skink, was very exacting. By the time the first act had been rehearsed over and over, nearly 2 hours had gone by. "We'll be here all night," complained a girl standing near Nancy. "It looks so, but I hope not. A friend of mine is waiting for me. Poor boy, he has a long drive after he takes me home. Maybe the second act will go faster." It was not long before the group of dancers came on stage, and one by one the girls began to perform their numbers. Soon it would be Nancy's turn. She glanced out into the auditorium, just in time to see Ned leave his seat hurriedly. Her eyes followed him up the aisle and into the corridor. As Ned emerged into the hallway, a pudgy man jumped him and shot a well-aimed blow at Ned's jaw. End of chapter 4.